you go. There's a couple padded seats available if anybody needs them. Well, Lisa has traveled from Tucson to be with us this evening. And of course, we consider it really special that she's here. Some of us have met her before, and some of us have read her books before. And she's a popular gal. I would call her a celebrity in Arizona, and it's really an honor to have her here. She has certainly led an active life in radio, and she was a TV reporter, a newspaper reporter. She's written for Arizona Highways. Her first book was Tucson, the Old Pueblo, and that was followed by 9 more books, all about various aspects of Arizona. But her most recent book, The Journal of Sedona Schnebly, is her great-grandmother's story. So it is special, and we're certainly happy to have her here, and I thank the Beaver Creek Preservation and Historical Society for hosting this, and it certainly is our pleasure. So please give a Beaver Creek warm welcome to Lisa Schnebly Heidinger.
It's an honor to be here. Not my first time at the school, but last time I was here, it looked very, very different. Karen Anderson Ward was the girl that every girl at Catalina High School wanted to be, and every boy wanted to go out with. She's shaking her head, but it doesn't make it any less true. It's true.
Well, I got the best.
Good. And it's delightful to be back up here. I've told a great many people about the day I came and spoke to that class, and realized for the first time that, because I was talking about the cancellation stamp on a letter and how Schnebly Station would not have fit with Arizona Territory. And as I was saying that, I thought, these are some pretty young people, and said, raise your hand if you've ever gotten mail that wasn't on a computer. I think there were 50 kids in that room, and maybe 6 hands went up. And every one of them was a birthday card from a grandparent. So keep sending those cards, because kids need to know what mail actually looks like in the real world. This is, more than anything, a relief to have done. I have honestly been collecting stories for this book since I was 24, which was a long time ago. And for the longest time, I knew that I wasn't really ready to write it. I had known from when I was little that my grandpa, he was Ellsworth to us. He was Tad to his parents, Sedona and TC, who were Carl and Dona to one another, called him Tad, because his brother, Dorsey Ellsworth, or D.E., because that's what they did in those families, they loved those initials, but he was Ellsworth, and so when you name your boy after your brother, and you're around the brother, and you've got the boy kept the name Tad, because when he was born, he would push his legs like a tadpole. So now I think of him as Tad more than I do of Ellsworth. His last job was Dry Beaver Creek School. It was the last teaching job he held. And he would take that road home to Oak Creek, and sometimes the weather was bad. And my dad said that Tad kept a sleeping bag and sardines in his classroom. And so he would just send word home with one of the kids on the bus to his wife, I'm not coming home tonight, and he would bed down there at the school. And so it's triply nice to be here, nice to be with all of you, nice to be back, and nice to be similar to where he was. He would have flipped if he had seen what you've turned this place into. It's magnificent. In any case, this is the story of his mom. My dad loves to say that he's the only person in the history of the world to be Sedona's grandson and Sedona's grandfather, because we named our daughter after the great-grandma. And when she was 2, and at that age they can't read, but they can recognize their names, we were going into Sedona, and she said, look, Mama, there's my town called me. So every time I'm there now, I have to send her, even though she's 25, a little text, your town called you, says hello. And our son, Rye, we named Rye Schnebly Heidinger, and he's the one that got the Northern Arizona gene the strongest. Went to NAU, works on campus, and shortly after he got there, he called and he said, okay, which do you think I like best? The view of the peaks, the scent of the pines, or the ravens? And I said, honey, I don't even care. If you love all those things, I could ask for no more. And it's so good for me to have someone who loves northern Arizona that much back up here, because we need people who love northern Arizona that much. And I envy every one of you for having figured out how to live here instead of just come up and visit like I do. But the book. I had always hoped I would find Sedona's journal. I knew that she wrote an hour a day after lunch, as I did all my life, and I journaled. And I kept looking. I looked in every bit of the Schnebly archives at Klein Library. I interviewed her children, her grandchildren, her friends. I read archives, and I finally decided only a couple of years ago that if there had been a journal, I would have found it by now. So probably what she did was she wrote an hour a day in correspondence, and it went all over the place to people who had no reason to think, I better hang on to this, it will be worth something someday, and didn't. So at that point, I thought, I think you know enough now that you can really just tell the story. I had heard about her from so many people that I had a sense of who she was by then. And my daughter, Sedona, was so much like her that filled any little blanks. I hesitate to get too caught up in the language of something I cannot explain, and so I don't really know how I wrote this. But what I do know is that every time I've done a book, 10 times now, it's too scary. I can't write a whole book. I can't do it. I get overwhelmed. But I can write the beginning. I know how I want it to start, and I know how I want it to end. And then every time I just sit down and think, okay, what are we going to do today? And we'll write about Montezuma's Castle today. And I fill it in just all piecemeal, and eventually I think, okay, it's done. And in this case, there was an extra step. I would say a prayer, that I say the right things, that I tell the right story. Somebody said, and it might have been Ed Abbey, there's truth and then there's facts. And a lot of things I didn't have a truth on, a fact. What were the names of all the guests who stayed with her? The last fact I found for this book that just delighted me, and it was from one of my grandpa's speeches that he had given to the Westerners, was, quoting, Dad, so T.C., was largely reared by a freed slave on the Schnebly plantation. When the war between the states broke out, Daniel Henry Schnebly Jr. freed his slaves and gave them land. And I spent a lot of time trying to find that slave's name in the census, and I never did. But I said a prayer and I got Boyle. So when I get to heaven, one of my first questions is going to be, Boyle Schnebly, are you here? And I'll find out how the whole book was done. The opening line of the book is, when I first saw the place that now shares my name, all I wanted was to be somewhere else. And she goes on to say, it's not that it wasn't pretty, but she had been on trains for 4 days with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And if you've traveled with small children, you know what that must have been like. And then when they get to the tent house where they were going to stay till Carl built the big 2-story house, even now, around these parts, it's so dark at night. And daughter Sedona, when we were driving out the last time, figured it out and put it into words. I've never been able to articulate why it's so dark. But she said, it's like you're on a ship on the ocean at night. You don't know where the horizon is. And I thought, that's what it is. So let's go back to when there were only 4 other families living in Oak Creek Canyon and make it that much darker, and know that there are grizzly and beaver and badger and fox and wildcat and whatever else, and just one man and his rifle. And that you came from Gorin, Missouri, where you had elocution lessons and spoke 4 languages, and had a milliner and a pharmacist and a doctor, and now you have nothing. And that had to be a hard night. But when she got up in the morning and looked outside, things got better. Carl's brother Ellsworth had urged us with such enthusiasm to move here, saying over and over he'd never imagined such a spot on earth. He was right. First, the rock was surreal. Mountains and hills and fortresses, and then stone spires on top of those other things, all in deep rust-colored richness. things seemed more three-dimensional than they did back home. And everywhere that wasn't taken up by these endless variations of stone was filled, festooned, decorated by green growing things, and overall was the music of the water. And she realizes they've done the right thing. They had not had great fortune back in Gorin, Missouri, little tiny town just south of the Iowa border. And it was because Philip and Amanda Miller's second daughter, Sedona Arabella Miller, was being courted by T.C. Schnebly, who was of the wrong religion. Gorin, Missouri was Methodist. Not Muslim, not Jewish. He was Presbyterian. And I had to really look to find out the difference. But in those days, it was enough to get Sedona written out of her mother's will, her parents' will. She had a sister, Lily. You know how there's always a pretty sister in every family? Lily was the pretty one. And Lily was being courted at the same time as Sedona was by Loring Johnson. So the scuttlebutt on the street of Gorin, Missouri was Philip Miller, their father, is going to get 100 sons-in-law. Loring is 1, and TC is double zeros. And I've always said, and I figure I get to say this because my family's been here a while, that Arizona has been settled by people who did not play well with others where they were. And I think in that case they saw the writing on the wall and realized that TC and a couple of brothers had opened a Schnebly Hardware in Gorin. But he knew it was not going to go well. And the brother, D.E., Dorsey Ellsworth, who was actually teaching here in the Verde Valley, kept writing to him saying, you have got to come out here. You've got to see this place. So they had Tad, they had Pearl, and then they came out. He rented a railroad car, brought all his stuff. The wife and kids followed a couple weeks later. And they ended up, I had to call Al Richmond, who is the railroad historian of northern Arizona, to say, what route did they take? Because I couldn't figure it out online. And he told me how they had gone. And they got into Jerome. Everything Carl had brought had just been on the railroad platform, and he would make wagon trips and finally took them all home. He then built the two-story house that you may have seen pictures of, that was where Los Abrogados now has the stone house. So their 80 acres was basically Tlaquepaque and Los Abrogados back to Brewer Road and down as far as 80 acres will take you, which was a prime piece of real estate for the time. But because I am in the Verde Valley, I'm also including in this D.E. Schnebly. And I will tell you quickly, because it was so amazing, that 2 weeks ago I was in Flint Ridge, California, and I had never spoken outside Arizona before. But it's Women's History Month, and they invited me out. And a gentleman walked into the bookstore with his wife. And he said, we were just walking by, and we saw this poster in the window, and I'm wondering if maybe we're related. My great-grandpa was named D.E. Schnebly.
Oh, wow.
And I said, you're he, and told them everything we knew about D.E. Schnebly. And the weirdest part is that Schnebly, T.C., Tad, my dad Larry, and I all got the famous or infamous Schnebly thumbs. Crooked and a finger. And D.E. had the same hands. We took a picture. And that more than anything, it's like we are kin. Nobody has this. And there he was. So he didn't know that his mother, Aunt Gretchen, had been close to the family. And it was just so exciting to meet somebody who actually knew D.E. So because D.E. taught over here, he took Carl, Sedona, Pearl, and Tad over to Montezuma Castle. And back in the day, they could climb the ladders. Tad was mad with excitement when Ellsworth said he always climbs up to look in. So I watched my 4-year-old boy get smaller and smaller, like a knapsack on Ellsworth's back, as he climbed what seemed like increasingly spindly ladders up the face of the rim. Once, when Tad let go of Ellsworth's neck to point at something, I clenched Pearl so tight she gave a surprised squeal and started a fuss. But after a while, they came back down, both panting and flushed, even though Ellsworth did all the work. Tad described some pots and fire circles inside. We took our lunch back behind Montezuma Well, which is a short wagon ride away. The well is an oval pool that looks like someone built it, but it's a natural limestone sink. Ellsworth says no one knows how deep the well is. They've not been able to dive to the bottom yet. When my dad was growing up, and he was born in 28, he had always heard that nobody knew how deep Montezuma Well was. And when I was doing a book about NAU a couple of years ago, I learned that the Navy, the first time they used scuba gear was to measure how deep. Was it 80 feet? 120? It's in the NAU book. Anyway, that's how they got down there, was the first scuba gear. One of the things I always forget to talk about is what the name Sedona is from. And the short answer is nothing. Her mother just made it up, was what we always heard. But pretty quickly, TC got his trees in the ground, started growing crops, was taking produce to Flagstaff, didn't want to go from Sedona to Jerome, up through the Verde Valley to Flagstaff, and saw that there was a likely way to get there up what is now Schnebly Hill Road. Went to George Babbitt with the Coconino County Supervisors, said, would you match my hundreds? We can do this. They did it. So then he's going up and coming back and bringing mail, general delivery, to the people in Indian Gardens and around his house, and thinks, well, heck, I could be postmaster. So you may know his requests on the application were Schnebly Station and Oak Creek Crossing, and that's what was deemed too long. And so then DE said, why not name it after Dona? And they did. Sedona Schnebly was unbelievably reserved. Everybody who knew her talked about how shy she was, and that she just had this incredible sort of decorum about her, which I didn't understand until my daughter Sedona grew up with exactly the same thing. And I'm not all that decorous, and so I wasn't sure I could write decorous until I realized that internally, Sedona, both of them were just as spritzy as any of us, but it was just that facade that was different. So when the post office is actually named, June 30th, 1902, I realize today I've not written because I'm embarrassed, but I should record that we now have a post office with my name. And she talks about Carl and Ellsworth getting silly about how it's Sedona at Sedona AT, and if you addressed a letter that way, you could even write Sedona AT squared, and maybe she'd get it. They were off again. I'm certainly honored, but also a little ruffled and unsettled. I have no idea how the subject of a post office name should act. Will this be a nuisance? As Carl pointed out, it's not like he's making me preside over a ribbon cutting. I think he thought I should just relax a little about it. I'll try. Easy for him to say. We should have named it Carl. And it really kind of was his town. He was so proud of it and of her and of the name, and was always such an ambassador for it. Just loved everything about the area. Sedona loved a little less having to deal with so many people and so many strangers. There was an interesting piece out of an Eastern newspaper. Young reporters in the day would take these Western forays and they would send back dispatches from the Wild West. And one of them described taking Thanksgiving with the Schneblys. And the 20 people sitting down, the whole roasted turkey and goose and all the side dishes and everything else, which was a neat way to find out what she had served. And then it was just a matter of kind of filling in the blanks for what happened. It really was splendid. Carl had provided the deer and hog, dressed the fowl, and was as always a genial and inclusive host. But only a woman notices the child wiping his nose on his sleeve who needs a discreet handkerchief, the one thirsty guest who keeps draining his water goblet looking expectant, the rapid eater tapping a foot with impatient longing for a sweet, while the talker down the table picks at desultory bites of the main course. While it was a slightly damp day, the wet leaves provided a plump, decaying carpet of sweet scent all around, and no one seemed eager to leave. I heard Carl happily entertaining the visitors as I cleared, with stories of how Wilson Mountain got its name, and Bear Howard's escapade. Bill Lane, who had closed his saloon in Camp Verde and ridden over for the day, told of not shooting a bear near Stoneman Lake, which doesn't sound like much, but in his dry style was quite amusing. So they hosted Thanksgiving, and then they also constantly hosted guests, because what would happen, and I heard this from various sources, including Babbitt's, is that people would come west, and if they ended up at the train station in Flagstaff, if they were tubercular or just wanted to travel, they were told to go to the Babbitt store and wait for Mr. Schnebly, and he'd take them down to Oak Creek Canyon. When they were tubercular, they stayed in tent houses down by the creek. Sedona would take food down so that her family and the other guests were not at risk, and felt bad for the people who didn't sleep in the big house, but they swore they loved, and I would prefer too Creekside if I had the choice. I'd rather sleep Creekside than at the big house. Sometimes the guests, because she was so reserved, were a bit of heavy lifting. In the late afternoons, wives can be bored and want to be entertained. They ask everything from if I've ever met an Indian, I have, to whether I've ever been attacked by one. I have not. If their poor Eastern faces then go a bit crestfallen, I cheer them up by telling them about killing rattlesnakes with a rake. That never loses its savor. The women perk up and chatter like magpies, wanting to know if it's hard, not terribly. How long the snake continues to move, it depends. And if I'm scared, always. It was different out west, clearly, we know, and we probably can't even imagine how different it truly was. The biggest difference, and the worst thing, was, you've probably heard the story of little Pearl when she was 5. Sedona then went on to have Genevieve, and when Genevieve was 2, Tad was 7, Pearl was 5, they were rounding up the cattle, which they would have had to do on the days Carl was away, and Tad and Pearl both had a cow pony. Genevieve was on the saddle between Sedona and the saddle horn. And Tad has written extensively about this, my grandpa, and he remembers that because he and Pearl had a tremendous arrowhead collection, she saw what he's pretty sure was a crystal white, and I'm guessing that would have been quartz of some type. To have her hands free to get it, she looped the reins around her neck and leaned down. And at that moment, one of the cattle began to stray, so the cow pony leaped after it, which is what cow ponies are trained to do. Pearl tumbled, and the reins kept her caught, and the pony panicked and raced back to the house, and by the time Sedona got there with the cattle and Genevieve, Pearl was completely broken and quite dead, and it was just awful. When I interviewed my Aunt Clara, when I was a young woman, I said, I don't have kids yet, and I'm sure it's the worst thing to lose a child. But she got so depressed, they left Oak Creek Canyon. Didn't everybody lose children? Isn't that just how life went? And Clara said, I've thought of that. I don't think it helped that Dad put that little grave right outside the kitchen window. And I think I looked a little startled. She said, men don't think. And then everything Mother did, it was just right there. I think, and Clara and the granddaughters also shared this thought, that it was kind of in part something like a nervous breakdown, a severe depression. She had the 3 small children, all the guests, the frontier housekeeping, and this just was sort of the final straw. So TC sold out to D.E., the brother, who had married a woman named Mary. They ended up in St. John's, and I was shooting a story years ago there for Channel 3 when Bo Udall was stepping down from Congress. And I was intrigued by the fact that David King Udall is, the tombstones where it's both of you? Well, it was all 3 of them. It was David King in the middle, and then the wives, Ida and Eliza, on either side. So since Mo was retiring, and that's the story, we're shooting video, and I look at the next row, and I see Schnebly, D.E., and Mary, and I think, that's where they ended up. I had never heard where they ended up, and since then I have met some descendants out in Mesa. But in any case, he sells out to them, takes Sedona back to Gorin. They make peace with the families, so that's good. Loring, remember Loring Johnson, asks him to put his money from the ranch into Loring's menswear store. Be my partner. And they want to get along with the family, so TC does that. He doesn't really like selling menswear, but his wife is doing better, and there's some family support, and so they do just fine. However, Loring isn't done causing them trouble yet. He absconds with their money. And Lily has to come over one night and say that she's been visited by the bankers saying, your husband cleaned out your personal account and the business account and said you would pay us the 4 months back rent, which was news to her. So they got a Pinkerton agent, and now they had to start over again. Carl really wanted to come back. He loved northern Arizona. Two things. One, by now they couldn't homestead here, and he really didn't have any money. And two, Sedona wasn't sure she was ready. She was afraid. She thought, I'm okay elsewhere, but what if I'm not okay back there? So you could still homestead up in Boyero, Colorado. And they went there. They had had Hank by now, another son, and they went to Boyero, Colorado. Sedona said later, and Carl built a gorgeous house. I am almost to the point where I want to go up and really see that house. Apparently he did wainscoting and chair rails and pocket doors and a dressing room and windows on all sides, and it was just a showplace. Whereas Boyero itself has very little to recommend it. Sedona says in the book, so wide, so flat, so spare. Carl and I joke that we could see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse coming days before the second coming. And it was tough up there. They farmed and he ran cattle. And Clara remembered vividly the years of the hailstorms. First it was grasshoppers, and the next year was hailstorms. And she put a bucket on her head to go bring in the chickens, because I guess chickens will look up at the rain and just drown if you leave them out there. So they said to Clara, get the chickens, get the chickens. And when she came in, her arms were full of bruises from that hail, and it ruined the crops. But she well remembers them sitting around the kitchen table and Carl coming in and just slightly shaking his head at Sedona to say, yeah, it's bad. But then at all the children sitting there looked and said, well, what's with all the long faces? Look at all the ice out there. Get some buckets, collect that, and we'll make ice cream. And they did. They made ice cream. They still had the cattle, so they had the butter and milk. But the cattle got anthrax. And I guess anthrax can live in soil dormant for a long time. And when it comes back up, you don't dare, even the cattle who don't have it yet are going to get it. And so Carl had to not only finish off the cattle that didn't drop dead, but obliterate, burn every bit of carcass, hair, hoof, hides, horn, because if you don't, it just keeps infecting. He did not have good lungs. When he was being largely reared by the freed slave at the plantation, we all know of the whole Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. area malaria, and he had gotten malaria as a kid. And they made him drink quinine in coffee, which put him off coffee for the rest of his life, and he never did have great lungs. So now, Tad is off teaching school, Hank is grown and gone, and Carl's basically running the whole outfit by himself and staying up all night to burn these carcasses, and gets really sick and doesn't get better. So Sedona finally thinks this is not going to improve and says, let's go back to Arizona. Phoenix is dry. He had a brother, Will, in Phoenix. Well, of course he wants to go back to Sedona, to Oak Creek Canyon, but she said he's so weak I can hold him with one finger while we go past. So they come to Phoenix. 50,000 people live there. They both hate Phoenix. And she thinks at least he'd be happy in Oak Creek. So they move back. And he's amazed that now the road that he built is officially called Schnebly Hill Road. And they move into it's still there. If you go 2 blocks up Schnebly Hill Road, little red boxcar looking house on there. And they move in there, and he works as the superintendent, caretaker of a CCC camp, which was where what I think of as King's Ransom, but is now Arabella, is today. One of the few flat places in that area. And that was the CCC camp. And Sedona did laundry for the men there, because Carl had an eye to the main chance, and he could always figure out a way to make money. So they did that. But Carl and Will Jordan of Jerome had been good friends. Will's boys, George and Walter, were now in the area, and they got to the point after the camp closed that they moved up on the Jordan land. And Carl basically helped the Jordan boys out. And Sedona sort of raised Ruth Jordan's kids. Everybody who knew Ruth said she was delightful, just almost like a little fairy, but didn't have 2 thoughts she could hook together. So Sedona sort of raised the Jordan kids in what is now that historical museum up on Jordan Road. And they were back where they belonged. And life was good. They loved the area. That was when things finally sort of were the way you wish they'd been all along. She wrote them morning and evening being the best times when she and Carl are back there. Waking up, realizing the night has passed, and I get to see sunrise again soon. and feel the warmth of the fire once I've stirred the banked coals and added some kindling, that then Bacon will send out a breakfast scent, and Carl will come in with his, "Well, Mother, you're as pretty to look at as you were yesterday," and for a moment place his hand on my cheek. When anyone is around, I feel foolish and odd if he touches me. But when we're alone, I can look in his eyes and let that love fold around me in the sweetest way. They were close their whole lives. I swear the older I get, the more I think a good marriage is part luck. But some of them are that good, and they did celebrate their 50th anniversary in Sedona, and we have pictures of that and all the kids coming back. And, among other events, grandmother, September 19th, 1928. Many things are cyclical. Seasons turn, everything and everyone ages. But while I know that, I still keep stopping, arrested by thought, whatever I'm doing. Wiping the table or drying knives, struck again by the fact Carl and I are grandparents. How can that be? I remember my grandparents. While kind, they seemed almost a different species than us, all folds and wrinkles, dry and rather musty, like they needed to be hung on the line and worked on with a carpet beater to bring back some vital color and freshness. Yet here we are, somehow 51 and 60, holding hands under the table and laughing at Carl's nonsense with a grandson. Lucille has given us a boy. It seems a grand and momentous thing, an exact time and day that another generation was launched by the birth of a person who doesn't yet know he is one. That was Larry. That was my dad. So I believe, and I didn't come to this by myself, that because Tad felt like Pearl died on his watch, look after your sister, he never left his mother for very long. He always taught in rural schools, mostly northern Arizona, did a stint in Wilcox, but then it was Chambers and Mayer and Dry Beaver and Fredonia and Denahotso, and he always had a permanent residence in Sedona. They were always home for holidays and big things. My dad was actually closer to Carl because he was the boy, and the girls were the ones who were with Sedona learning Bible verses and her teaching them piano and things like that, Patsy and Paula. But all of them were around a great, great deal for most things. And my dad can still show me where on the road Lucille shot a Thanksgiving turkey one time between Sedona and Flag. And some of the other places that are still sort of, if you're taking a walking tour, the Cook Pioneer Cemetery at the base of Airport Mesa. When they moved back, Carl, by then there was a cemetery, and so Carl moved Pearl from where she had been on the Los Abregados site up to the Cook Pioneer Cemetery, where she is now with Sedona and Carl. And Clara told me the story, and I've looked ever since for reinforcement on this. But Carl had written there that he went to get Pearl and move her and dug her up very carefully because he didn't know if that little casket had held, but it had. And when he got her up, he just had to see her again, which you're thinking is not a good idea, but Clara says that Dad wrote he opened that little coffin, and for a minute, Pearl looked like she had just fallen asleep for her nap. And then the dust hit her. The air hit her, and she turned to dust. And I've talked to geologists. I have not yet found anybody who can explain to me the properties of the clay in that area. But either there was just a miracle because Carl had been through enough, or something somehow does that. And I don't know which of those two is true. I would like to know. Another thing that is still there is the bell at Wayside Chapel, because when Sedona, she had cancer, and she knew she was dying, and said to Carl, I don't want flowers. Flowers are of the earth. Music is of the heavens. And they raised money and got a bell. Hank was living in Denver, and he found one at a foundry, and they set it down, and it's still there at the Wayside Chapel right by the Matterhorn. They still ring it on Mother's Day for Sedona. So where they're buried is there. The little house at the base of Schnebly Hill Road is there. The house up on Jordan Road, well, it's not on Jordan Road, it was on Jordan property, and they've torn it down, and there's a planter in the middle of a parking lot. And for years I thought, now why would they have done that? Why would they have torn down the founder's home? By the way, in this book, should you not want to buy it, are 30 pictures of family photos, and they are all on my website. I bought SedonaSchnebly.com, so you can go there and see all the pictures and read a little bit about them. One of them is of that last house. Had the two-story house at Los Abrigados not burned down, I'm sure the city fathers and mothers would have kept it. But this last house does not give what I think Sedona wants the proper image of the founders to be. It was not a shack, but it was by no means impressive. And so they knocked that down. I am just about ready to go to Boyero and see if there's some way to put that two-story house on a truck or something and bring it down, because the idea of having a house that Carl Schnebly built here is just too appealing for me to forget about. So I'm going to see if I can make that happen. But they did go on to see their 50th wedding anniversary. And he then lived out there 3 more years after she did, and was always the mayor, ambassador, chamber of commerce, what have you. And he had figured out somewhere in their relationship that the stalk that comes out of a century plant, if you slice it, it's perfect, those discs, as a pincushion. It's just right for pincushions. And he would sign his name on the bottom. If it was porous with a tool, he would kind of burn T.C. Schnebly. And if it was dense, he would use ink. And 25 years ago, Arizona Highways asked if I would write a story about Schnebly Hill Road, drive it with my dad. So he told me all the stories he knew about it, which are, of course, in the book. And I wrote about the pincushions, because he thought of that. And 6 weeks or so after the story came out, I got an envelope from Arizona Highways. A woman who had been on her honeymoon had met T.C. in 1952, and he had given her one of those pincushions, and she sent it to me, which was just such a lovely thing of her to do. I would love to answer questions if anybody has anything. I could talk all night about it. I could just read you the entire book, but I'm not going to do that. Is there anything anybody would particularly like to hear about? I wasn't that way. Judy.
Did you actually have the journal of Sedona?
I did not actually get the journal. So in the foreword I wrote about this, what if she had sealed the journal, put it with the family papers, asked that it not be opened for 65 years so nobody could get hurt feelings. And then in 2017, Peter Runge at Special Collections had found it and sent it to me. This is what I would have wanted to read. So this is the journal I wish I had found. And somebody came up and said, well, These Is My Words was a journal. And I said, well, yes, but it was a journal written by somebody later. And 1,000 White Women is a wonderful book written by somebody later. And there are certainly original frontier journals. Martha Summerhays Vanished Arizona. And her language is quite lofty. It makes Sedona sound downright uneducated. She really had a classical education. So there are some out there, but the vast majority somebody had to help with, like this one. Yes, sir.
Do you know more information about the young lady Mary, who later married Peter County?
I do, and it was kind of interesting. I have one piece written by Mary Luella Hughes when she was older, and it's clear she was not happy living with Sedona and working there on the ranch, and I don't know why. It's a little snarky, but it's highly possible there are 1,000 reasons. She had been one of D.E.'s students when he first taught back in Cahokia before he came west. And they had corresponded for like 15 years, and her invalid parents finally died. And he proposed by mail, and she accepted, and she took a train out to Flagstaff and married him, which was incredibly brave of her to do that. I believe he was very kind and a good guy, and they did stay together forever. And they are both over in St. John's. Apparently, he never converted to Mormonism, but they did raise their children, LDS. And they have a son, Larry, who's in Mesa, I know now, because there are 2 Larry Schneblys, my dad and that one. So she was a teacher and probably a very good mother and just didn't want to work for Sedona. So I tried to be careful about that, but my only primary source material seems to... What she did do that Sedona felt bad about was after she took over the ranch, she wouldn't take any lung patients, and they fired the Chinese cook. the ad that was in the Coconino Sun says white cook. And that made Sedona sad because their Chinese cook, who was oddly named Charles Rutledge, and there actually was a Charles Rutledge in Jerome. So I believe that the Chinese cook took the name of a man he admired in Jerome and came to work for the Schnebly family and loved them and was beloved by them. And so she regretted the fact that white cook was more of a priority after she left. But went on to say, I turned my back on it. I have no quarter to complain. It's my fault. I left. Yes?
What's the name of the cemetery and where is it again?
Cook Pioneer Cemetery. If you're in Sedona, Airport Mesa, you make that, I'm coming from down from the Y in my mind, so it would be a left turn onto Airport Mesa. But the Worm bookstore is right there. And right behind the Worm bookstore is a right turn to the Elks Lodge. And if you make that turn and look to your right, there's the cemetery. So if you walk in, it's not very big. If you walk in the little arched gate and just keep going back, TC and Sedona and Pearl are on your left. Should you happen to go, we had a river guide once who never walked in the sand on any hike because he wanted everybody to feel like they were the first people to see it. Sometimes I go to visit the family plot and people have left stuff. I know they mean to pay respect, but what really kind of creeps me out is I had gone when I was in New Orleans to see where the voodoo queen, Marie Laveau, was buried. And people would leave coins on her gravesite as a supplication to the voodoo priestess. And sometimes I find coins on Sedona's grave, which I find distinctly unnerving. People leave truckers' caps, they leave Mardi Gras beads, they leave all kinds of stuff, and it ruins the idea that you're the first person there. So I hereby deputize every one of you, should you ever be up there, and should you be so inclined, take it. Whatever is there, take it. There are big dumpsters by the Elks Lodge. And if there's one little flower behind each of the 3 headstones, that's all that should be there. Everybody should get to feel like they're the first people there. And if anybody calls you on it, and the chamber backs me, and the historical museum backs me, so say, hey, Lisa Schnebly told me to do this. You will be vindicated. You don't have to, just if you feel like it. Yes?
Would you like to speak about writing the official book on the centennial?
Arizona Centennial book. That was fun, and maybe some of you have seen that. I don't know. It's out of print now, which I thought was an unfortunate decision. But it was the 100 best parts of Arizona, and marvelous fun to travel the state and learn the things. And similar to this book, but different, feel like a lot of the stories that I had picked up over the years now were someplace. One of those was Kel Fox. We all know the Fox Ranch exit. And Kel Fox Jr. was a big water conservation visionary before most people were. And one time I was visiting him with my kids. I wanted them to meet him. They were little. And he was talking about what I just mentioned, how the young men would come west and do dispatches and things like that. And this is back when Foxborough had been a boys' school and a dude ranch and some other things. Everybody, TC, the guy that owned Winona, they were all scrabblers. They all did a little bit of whatever they had to keep things together. But Kel remembered when he was a little boy that a young man had come to work for the family, just to get, a little money and some rest and some food, and couldn't stay on a horse. And so his dad gave him a gentler horse, couldn't stay on that one either. And finally, he was down to the oldest, tiredest, slowest, gentlest horse he had, and the guy couldn't stay seated. And Kel said my dad felt bad about it because he was a nice young man, but he had to let him go. Took a lot of pictures, and later he sent us some of those pictures. I wish I knew where those were. Most people don't have pictures of their family home taken by Ansel Adams. And they never did find him. Patty died. Every time I saw his widow, Patty, when I would say, find pictures? Nope. So we don't know where those ended up. And another favorite story from that book, Billy Adams was the guy that created Winona. And Winona, as in the Route 66 song, for years had the metal rail, the metal bar that would swing out from the back of the store to the track, and they would hang the leather mailbag on that. So whoever was on the train would lean out, grab